In the design and use of weapons, natural elements are harnessed as a destructive technology with human and non-human effects. What occurs in the process of deploying this harmful technology is that accountability for the use of such violent force is distanced from the weapon's engineered purpose. This lack of accountability, particularly in aerial bombardment, makes its effects appear beyond human control. Falling short of deterring the use of weapons, international law forms part of a developed technology of warfare, as powerful states engage its elastic parameters to legally legitimize the engineering of violence. This is the lethal technology of the legal threshold of targeted strikes and military necessity. The risk of this violence manifests in the materialization of the lived-built environment. The home remains the only answer to safety against destruction deployed through this force. However, access to the shelter of the home is restricted by entangled political, legal, social, and economic conditions. To dismantle the failings in international law and the asymmetric power structures it creates, an argument is made in critical legal theory for a study of the colonial and imperial legacies ingrained in the law and its practice. In this recorded lecture performance, the designed nature of this technology is unpacked using feminist and decolonial methods of archival and filmic investigation into the little-known events that take place in the Allied invasion into Vichy French-controlled Lebanon and Syria in 1941. During the Second World War, the first widespread use of aerial bombardment, legitimized through the legal construct of military necessity, allowed two foreign forces to fight for control and access to natural resources across the territory. Archival evidence from the British government charts neo-colonial strategies and interventions of destruction and development across Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan. The work traces the human and non-human effects of this in an attempt at placing accountability and dismantling the ongoing capacity of law as structural violence.
هذا بيتنا. سوري انه ما فيني استقبلكم بهيك حالة. هذا بيت مسكر من وقت حرب الجبل، وبعدين كان مستحلينه 7-8 سنين. اول بيت بنبنى بالاسمنت بالبيتون. اول بيت بالضيعة، كل البيوت كانت تراب تنحدل على الايد. وهذا البيت أول كارثة وصلته هي بالحرب العالمية الثانية، وقت اللي اجى الجيش الفرنسي البرو فيشي تابعين لفيشي، وكانوا بحالة تضعضع هربانين من بيت الدين، لأن بيت الدين كمان انضربوا بالطائرات. اجوا القوات الإنجليزية، قوات الحلفاء، وبالطائرات كشفوا شافوا انه في وجود عسكري، وضربوا بالطائرات، ضرب البيت وخرب مرة تانية. هلا بفرجيك فوق بعد في اثر لحد هلا بالسقف، لان صار في فجوات بالبيتون، وكمان ما حدا عوض علينا، راحت. هذا قصة بيتنا. هذا كان أول بيت بتعمر سطحه من إسمنت، إنه كنا مثل بريفيليجيه، كنا إنه نحن عنا شانس إنه بيتنا من سطحه ما بينحدر، سطحه بيتون. لأعطيك مثل شو خربوا بأيام التهجير. هذه كانت الحمام، بقى كلها كان مكسر ومأخوذ كل الأساطر والمغاسل والحمام، كل شيء انأخذ. بعد ما صلحنا winter they came here. شايف الأثر كله، هيدا أثر الضرب. هذه الأوضة أكتر شيء انضربت، سقفها كان في فتحة كبيرة كتير، وبعدين صلحناها بقيت تنش، لأن البيتون ما بيخضع بعضه. بقى شوف الأثر، محل ما فيه علامات مثل تنقيع ماي، هذه هي محل ما انضرب. الأطفال أو الأولاد اللي كانوا بعمر يوقعوا على المرحلة، بدل ما كانوا يطلعوا يتخبوا وقت تجي الطيارة تضرب، يظهروا ليتفرجوا عليها. هذه الغرفة الثانية كمان مثل الأولى، انصاب سطحها. عندك أثار بهالزاوية، هون كان في فجوة كبيرة تصلحت، بس بما انه الحديد كان مضروب رجعت على سد الحديد عم ببين الاثر تبعها.
Through testimony and archival evidence, Under Multiple Suns produces a brief documentary account of the history of violence that takes place across Lebanon and Syria during the Second World War. In the film, Subhi Antonios describes the events whilst re-encountering its effects on his bombarded home, revealing the scars they both still carry, creating a close and entangled relationship between Subhi and the concrete materiality of his home, in human and non-human discursive interaction, made legible through the film's soundtrack. The film exposes the historic legacy of a condition inscribed into the materiality of the lived-built environment in Lebanon as both a constructed and deconstructed existence under multiple suns, and begins to frame the history of these events in the larger processes by which international law came to legitimize the violence of aerial warfare, pointing to the ways by which this legitimation has served to reinforce and exacerbate violence throughout the decolonized world. These images show the residence deepen, a colonial-style building located in Beirut's pine forest, known as Hosh Beirut or Kasr al-Snoubar, the Palace of the Pines. Taken from a British warplane, the stills reveal the moments just before and after the bombardment of the residence by the British Royal Air Force in 1941. The architecture of the residence reflects Beirut's early modernization between the Ottoman period and the Mandate, and materializes the complex geopolitics that affects Lebanon's lived-built environment. In a book on the residence deepen, French historians Denis Amoun and Pierre Fournier describe in detail the developing design of the building during this period between 1941 and 1945. However, there's no mention in the book of the destruction caused by this bombardment. This buried history reveals how difficult it is to uncover any truthful detail of the British military campaign that led to the destruction depicted in these images. The evident attempt to obscure the violence of the Allied invasion is indicative of wider attempts of erasure of what took place, making the impact of this history widely unknown and contested. Given that the residence was a recognized monument of French governance in Lebanon, its bombardment by the Royal Air Force points to this being a purposeful attack as a demonstration of force, or worse, that such widespread bombardment took place that the destruction of this building was part of its collateral damage. Either way, this archival material is evidence of the violence that took place at the scale of the lived-built environment across Lebanon in 1941. Close examination of the top secret British government documents and reports highlighted in the film outline attempts at a complex of neo-colonial strategies over political, legal, architectural and agricultural developments, not just in Lebanon, Syria and Iraq, but across Palestine, Egypt, Jordan and beyond. In Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land and Racial Regimes of Ownership, legal theorist Brenna Bandar refers to the value of the domestic space as a space of security from harm, as she further outlines that the safety provided by the materiality of the domestic space is not equally accessible. Bandar unpacks the historic interactions of geography, race, and rights to private property, as how the colonial encounter produced a racial regime of ownership that persists into the present, creating a conceptual apparatus in which justification for private property and ownership remains bound to a concept of the human that is thoroughly racial in its makeup. Thus, not only was property law the primary means of appropriating land and resources, but property ownership was central to the formation of the proper legal subject in the political sphere. The top secret government documents highlighted in the film outline attempts to dictate a new phase of globalization by developing a racialized capitalist system built not only through economic mechanisms of land and resource appropriation, but also through the legitimized use of such violent methods, including the use of aerial bombardment, through international law. The importance of investigating the historic formation of this burgeoning technology is to unpack the processes of violent division created through its neocolonial influence. Neocolonial violence is hidden in legal impunity through methods that divide and obscure the possibility of observing its far-reaching and embedded nature, a purposeful part of its strategies, so as not to be fully learnt, unlearnt, deterred or held accountable. This is not only in regards to its historic consequences, but also in the contemporary continuation of its harmful effects. In response to these outlined issues, an important movement in critical legal theory argues that a historic turn is necessary in order to understand the current failings of international law. The proposition is that a study of the colonial and imperial historic legacies ingrained in the law and its practice must be undertaken to expose the coloniality of law's authority and in turn its limited frame of accountability. By examining the historical processes responsible for inequalities produced through law's enforcement, we can come to understand the fallibility of its defining principles. International law's authority and legitimacy rests on its claim to operate universally, capable of representing and protecting all of humanity equally. Any suggestion that it operates with bias goes against these founding principles and undermines its claim to justice. Critical legal scholars argue that colonial biases and hierarchies remain deeply embedded in the institutions of international law, and efforts to ignore or suppress such legacies only serve to replicate and exacerbate the ongoing effects of colonial systems. Legal theorist Anne Orford points to one aspect of this problem. Many international legal regimes are based on the assumption that current extremes of uneven development, inequality, mass movements of peoples, civil war, food insecurity and poverty are the consequence of the inherent characteristics of failed leadership of post-colonial states, rather than the effects of a historically constructed global political and economic system that can be challenged. Orford explains that proponents of international law fail to recognize the continuity between its colonial past and the contemporary multilateral legal systems that produce and exploit resilient populations. In this way, international law becomes an internalized belief system, producing complacency in regards to its known failures. A study of the 1907 Hague Convention is key here, in attempts at analysing the legal processes involved in the legitimization of aerial warfare, because of its role in endorsing the legal argument of military necessity, meaning that the laws of war could only restrict belligerent forces to act in accordance with their own military self-interests. This elasticity meant that belligerents could legally justify nearly any conduct of violence during warfare. Military necessity is the argument for placing the lives and bodies of the enemy civilian in a greater position of risk and mortal threat for the benefit and protection of the attacking belligerent state. The industrialization of aerial warfare following the 1907 Hague Convention and in the lead up to the Second World War meant that both the Allied and Axis forces could deploy the extra technological capacities of the laws of war to legally legitimize widespread aerial bombardment. The legal protections for such exercises of violence were further enhanced during the Nuremberg trials, the War Crimes Tribunal of the Second World War. Though this tribunal was effective in criminalizing the horrific genocide conducted by the Axis forces, it left the widespread use of aerial bombardment undertaken by both the Axis and Allied forces unpunished as a criminal act. This is argued as being the result of the Nuremberg trials being led and influenced by the Allied forces, who did not want legal scrutiny into their own violent actions, setting a dangerous precedent. Following the Nuremberg trials, air power entered the post-war period free of all constraints, save those imposed by its own technological and economic restrictions. This underscores international law's capacity to legitimize rather than to restrict the continuation of such violence today. In her account of the Nuremberg trials, journalist Rebecca West predicts the significance of this moment in the evolution of the technology of warfare. She says, "A machine was running down, a great machine, the greatest machine that has ever been created, the war machine. There was another machine which was warming up, the peace machine, by which mankind lives its life. All over the world, people were sick with impatience because they were bound to the machine that was running down and wanted to be numbered amongst the operators of the machine that was warming up." Legal theorist Louisa Slava further points to the importance of the Second World War period in regards to the harmful impact of this technology in the creation of nation-states out of former colonies, and the expansion of a global capitalist order leading to the consolidation of today's multiple global regimes of governance. Through this, Aslava explains the legal framing of civil wars. As the nation-state form took hold across the globe, local populations came to be ever more subject to economic and political national interests and international pressures. This situation, especially from World War II onwards, transformed warfare and its technologies of killing into an increasingly internal affair. Less international, but perhaps more chronic and systemic. Internal wars, categorized now as civil wars, have become a key marker of our present world. There is a critically unspoken assumption that gives rhetorical power to the idea of a legal war, specifically that a legal war is more humane than an illegal war. Examining the historical developments of these laws reveals that, despite attempts to the contrary, the laws of war have privileged military necessity and state-perpetrated violence at the cost of humanitarian values. The evolution of internationalism in relation to aerial bombardment now presents huge obstacles for anyone seeking to hold belligerent states accountable against the use of such violent methods. Uneven access to shelter produced through the shared impact of a colonial legal system only heightens the effects of these asymmetric power structures. The power struggles that produced the laws of war in the past are inscribed in the legal and political frameworks within which present and future conflict threatens to be fought. Understanding the specific and interconnected nature of this technology and its effects calls for further engaged methods of radical solidarity and resistance in the dismantling of its effective frameworks. In response, and in feminist, decolonial, critical, legal, and poetic practice-based operative discussion, my proposition for a frame of accountability comes in a series of non-linear short films produced through the genre I term as legal fiction. In addressing the historic moments in the neo-colonial construction of the described legal technology, frame of accountability foregrounds a contract of risk created by these events, imposed on the racialized consequence of decontextualizing resource commodities through capitalist financial systems and violent modes of conflict. As resource commodities are disconnected from bodies, land, and context to enter financial markets to be converted into capital value, international laws of war and aerial bombardment become the violent processes undertaken by strong states to secure sovereignty and control over bodies, land, and resource. With the aim to recontextualize risk, the story is told through a complex of human and non-human voices that give testimony to the disproportionate effect of this lived limit condition. The legal fiction is told as a speculative attempt at dismantling the continued capacity of international law as structural violence. In Frame of Accountability, Untouching Ground, seen in the short clip, I give my account of the historic events in the Allied invasion into Vichy French-controlled Lebanon and Syria after the discovery of the personal archive of General Spears at Oxford University, engaging a practice to decolonize the Spears archive to reveal how military necessity allowed two foreign forces to fight for control and access to natural resources across Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. The film traces the human and non-human effects of these events to undo a temporal and spatial distance constructed in distinguishing this violence as environmental or conflict-based. Connecting from this point of history, the violent processes developed in the name of defence, also as environmental violence. This is done through a careful and close situated retracing of the routes taken into and through Lebanon and Syria in the invasion, as aggressively outlined on a colonial map uncovered in the Spears archive, taking careful steps across the land and routes as a filmic untouching of the ground, and as an inversion of the distance aerial view of warfare. From an archival photograph discovered at the Arab Image Foundation in Lebanon, Frame of Accountability, in her view, reveals the sexual exploitation of a woman by occupying Australian soldiers fighting for the Allied forces. Engaging feminist and decolonial methods, the film moves through the archival evidence to sense, trace, and position her encounter as a form of poetic testimony. The episode points to a lack of visibility of the perpetration of such violence that takes place at the scale of the body and the domestic space under such a state of exception, bringing this lack of visibility of the scale of the domestic space and the body in the laws of war into sharp view. frame of accountability, in law's terms, is told through the imagined voice of a feminist, queered, intersectional international law, as this legal fiction narrates law's consciousness coming to terms with its own failings. The episode unravels this complex human-non-human subjectivity. The work reveals how law's embedded corruptions continuously break at its core aims. My intention for using the speculative legal frame is to highlight the inherent issues and failures in the current international legal framework in relation to the legally legitimized forms of international violence, materialized through aerial bombardment and the uneven access to shelter. Engaging a feminist decolonial, critical, legal and poetic practice-based discussion to unravel the specific and interconnected effects of this technology in the call for further radical solidarity and resistance in the dismantling of its ongoing effective frameworks. This is in the attempt of placing accountability and dismantling the ongoing capacity of law as structural violence.